Hello, my name is Nolan Caldwell, 36 years old. I currently live in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of Scottsdale, Arizona, a place where large glass doors open to a view of the fiery red desert, and the golden sunlight blazes like it's scorching everything in its path. I am a senior advisor for an international real estate investment fund with an estimated net worth of over $500 million. By my side is always Katie, my 8-year-old daughter, a bright girl with shimmering blonde hair and clear blue eyes like the Arizona sky, who never fails to make me smile with joy. Hearing this, you might think my life is painted in shades of rose, filled with light and glory. But no, 4 years ago my life wasn't radiant at all. Back then I was a rejected outcast, an adopted child lost in the powerful Caldwell family, living amidst scornful remarks and contemptuous glances. In that darkness, only Katie, my precious little daughter, was the sole light guiding me, keeping me from crumbling. 4 years ago, I didn't live in wealth and power as I do now. My daughter and I were cramped in a rented apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix where the walls were stained and the ceiling fan creaked incessantly. Every night I sat by Katie's bed watching her sleep and wondering if I had the strength to give her a better life. I didn't have hundreds of millions of dollars nor a senior advisory role. I was just a single father, scraping by with odd jobs to provide for my daughter. It all began the day the Caldwell family, the family I once called home, turned their backs on me. I was adopted as a months-old infant. Edward and Margaret Caldwell, a powerful couple in Scottsdale, took me in when they had no children of their own. Edward, a real estate tycoon with eyes as sharp as knives and a voice that boomed like thunder, was the most formidable man I ever knew. Margaret, my adoptive mother, was gentle but distant, as if she were merely fulfilling an obligation to a child not of her blood. I grew up in their lavish mansion, well provided for but never pampered. I was not the hope or heir of the family, just a piece to maintain the Caldwell family's facade, an adopted child existing to complete the picture of a perfect family. When I was 5, everything changed. Edward and Margaret began having their own children: James, Clara, Victoria, and Henry. I, the adopted child, became the odd one out in the household. My siblings, though young, quickly learned to look at me with disdain. "Nolan, the picked-up kid," Clara once whispered to Victoria, her voice sharp as a blade. I tried to fit in, doing menial tasks at Edward's company, from running errands to learning how to read financial reports, hoping for a nod of approval from him. But Edward never patted my shoulder or said he was proud. I was just a shadow, silently existing in the glamorous world of the Caldwells. When I was 25, Edward arranged for me to marry Elizabeth, the daughter of Richard Harper, a major business partner of his. The marriage wasn't my choice, but part of Edward's plan to solidify business ties. Elizabeth was beautiful, with a radiant smile and sharp eyes, but I sensed the strain in every handshake. Edward gave us a separate mansion on the outskirts of Scottsdale, with a sprawling garden and windows overlooking the fiery desert. I thought it was a reward, but later I realized it was just Edward's way of keeping me under his control. Our marriage began with forced smiles, and I naively hoped I could build a real family. A year after Elizabeth and I married, we welcomed our first child, Katie. She had eyes as blue as the Arizona sky and a smile that melted away all my worries. Katie was the most precious gift heaven ever gave me. But Elizabeth, the wife I had hoped would build a home with me, began to change. She became irritable, lashing out for no reason. In the evenings, she would disappear, returning with the smell of alcohol and bloodshot eyes. I tried to talk to her, to ask what she needed, but she would scream, calling me controlling. One night, when Katie was just 5, I found Elizabeth collapsed in the living room of our mansion, next to a bottle of liquor and scattered white pills on the floor. She yelled as I tried to help her up, and then she slapped me, a hard blow that left my ears ringing. Katie stood in the corner of the room, clutching her doll, sobbing. In that moment, I knew I couldn't go on. I filed for divorce. It wasn't an easy decision, but I had to protect Katie no matter the cost. Elizabeth left without contesting custody, and I thought that was the end of the worst of a political marriage that had lasted over 7 years. But it wasn't. When Edward, my adoptive father, whom I had once respected like a real father, learned of my divorce, he saw it as betrayal and stupidity. He summoned me to his office on the top floor of the company building. I still remember that moment clearly, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind me, the smell of leather and oak from his massive desk, the golden light casting shadows on the oversized family portrait on the wall. I stood there, my heart tightening, bracing for his wrath. Edward looked at me with cold, almost hateful eyes, his voice cut like a knife. "You dare destroy the relationship with the Harpers? Who do you think you are, Nolan? An adopted kid who dares defy me?" I tried to explain. I told him about the nights Elizabeth came home drunk, about the screams that terrified Katie, about the times I had to hold my daughter to make her feel safe. But Edward didn't care to listen. He waved his hand as if to dismiss my words entirely. "You're ungrateful," he said, his voice so cold it made me shudder. "I gave you a mansion, money, a life any man would dream of. And this is how you repay me?" I wanted to argue, to say that my daughter's love and safety mattered more than all those material things. But Edward gave me no chance. That same day, he took back the mansion, fired me from the company, and cut off all financial support. In front of the entire staff, he disowned me as if I were just a number in his ledger, nothing more. My siblings, James, Clara, Victoria, Henry, who had always despised me for being adopted, now openly mocked me. I still remember James's smirk as he whispered in my ear while I packed up my personal belongings from my desk. "Finally, your true colors show, Nolan. An outsider forever." I was hurt, angry, but powerless. I was just the adopted kid, while James was the cherished biological child. Returning to the luxurious mansion my father had ordered reclaimed, I quietly packed my and Katie's personal belongings. That day it poured in Scottsdale, the raindrops falling heavily on the marble steps, echoing hollowly in the cold, empty space. I had no choice but to find a temporary rented apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix, a place with stained walls, the smell of old wood lingering in the air, and creaky floors under every step. That afternoon, when I picked Katie up from school and brought her to the new apartment, she asked in surprise, "Daddy, where are we? Why aren't we going home?" I could only crouch down, look at her, and softly say, "From now on, this is our home." Katie stared at me for a moment as if trying to understand, then quietly said nothing more. That first night in the cramped apartment, I sat by Katie's bed watching her sleep soundly. Her eyes gently closed, her small hands still clutching her favorite teddy bear. My heart was heavy, not just from losing the mansion, the job, or the status, but from the deep pain, the sting of betrayal by the man I had respected and called father. The months that followed were dark. I took on any job to provide for Katie, loading cargo, delivering packages, serving at a cafe, freelance writing, anything that could bring in a few bucks. Some nights I went hungry to save food for her. But Katie, that bright and sensitive girl, was always the faint light in the darkness. Every time she smiled, every time she hugged me and whispered, "Daddy, you're my superhero," I found a reason to keep going. Gradually, I learned to repair electronics and opened a small shop on a street corner. Customers started coming and the business slowly took off. Life wasn't easy, but it began to stabilize. Katie and I had each other, and for me, that was enough. Then one day I heard that Edward had suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized. A few senior staff members from the company with whom I had maintained contact informed me. Edward wasn't just seriously ill and hospitalized, he was also alone, with no family by his side to care for him. I heard that James was still running the company but spent more time partying. Clara and Victoria were busy with extravagant trips. Henry, the youngest, was caught up in failed projects. None of them stayed at the hospital to care for Edward. They only visited briefly, asked perfunctory questions, and left. A senior executive texted me, "Edward's lonely, Nolan. He mentions you, but you know how he is. too proud to admit he was wrong. I thought about visiting and talking to him many times, but every time I stood at the hospital door, I could hear his words echoing, "You're ungrateful," like a knife stabbing my chest. I was afraid to face him, afraid to see that cold gaze again. But then Katie, that small but sensitive girl, pulled me back. One afternoon, as I was hunched over fixing a computer in the shop, Katie gently tugged at my hand, her sparkling eyes looking up at me. "Daddy, is Grandpa okay? I want to see him." I choked up looking at her, and I knew I couldn't say no. We began visiting the hospital. Each time I only dared to stand in the corner of the room, silently watching Edward, the frail, gaunt old man lying in the hospital bed, his hands thin and bony. Katie wasn't afraid. She sat by his side, telling him about school, the new cat we adopted, singing the songs she loved. Edward, the man who was once cold and powerful, smiled, and for the first time I saw his eyes soften. Once he gently held Katie's hand and whispered, "You're a lot like your dad, Katie." Very much. Those words made my heart race, but I didn't know what they meant. And so my daughter and I started a new routine. Every afternoon after picking Katie up from school, we would stop by the hospital to visit her grandfather, the man lying alone amidst the stark white walls. I never approached him, only stood quietly at a distance, my eyes fixed on his frail figure in the hospital bed. I wanted to speak, to let go of the past and mend things, but the old wounds still lingered, smoldering in my heart, keeping me from finding the courage to take that step forward. One afternoon, the doctor in charge of my father's care called me into his office. His voice was calm but solemn. "We've done everything we can, but Mr. Edward doesn't have much time left, Nolan. The family should prepare themselves." Those words hit me like a hammer to the chest, leaving me breathless. In that moment, I didn't know what I was feeling, grief, anger, or simply a cold, spreading void. Edward, my adoptive father, who had once been the center of my world, the man who had coldly disowned me, was now slipping away forever. Katie, my 8-year-old daughter, was unaware of the doctor's warning. She sat by Edward's bedside, her small hands holding his, chattering about the new cat we had at home and how it chased a ball around the apartment. "Grandpa, the kitty's name is Muffin and she's so naughty. Yesterday she knocked over Daddy's glass of water." Katie giggled, her bright blue eyes sparkling. Edward, though frail, managed a smile, a rare one I hadn't seen since he cast me out of the family. Watching Katie, I realized she was doing what I lacked the courage to do, bringing light to Edward's final days. One day, as I was organizing things in my small repair shop, Katie tugged at my hand and said, "Daddy, Grandpa looks so sad. I want to make him happier." Her words choked me up. Katie gradually became the unexpected bridge between us. She didn't just talk about Muffin or school, she talked about me. "Daddy works so hard, Grandpa," she said in her clear, innocent voice. "He fixes computers for people and he always reads me bedtime stories." I stood in the corner of the room pretending to look out the window, but I was listening to every word. Edward didn't say anything, just nodded, but I noticed a change in his eyes. They were no longer cold as before. There was something softer, as if he were seeing me through Katie. One afternoon, while Katie was playing in the hospital lobby, Edward suddenly called my name. "Nolan." His voice was faint, almost a whisper. Startled, I stepped closer to his bed, my heart pounding. "Thank you, son, for being here after everything I've done," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. "I don't want Katie to be sad," I said, my voice hoarse. Edward fell silent, his lips trembling as if trying to say something he didn't have the strength to express. In the days that followed, Edward and I began to talk, though our conversations were brief and hesitant. He asked about my shop, about how I was raising Katie. I shared, but I always kept a distance, afraid that opening up too much would leave me vulnerable to hurt again. Once Edward looked at me and said, "You've done well with Katie. She's an amazing child." His words stunned me. It was the first time I'd heard Edward praise me, even indirectly. I wanted to ask why. why he had disowned me. But I couldn't bring myself to. I was afraid the answer would shatter the fragile hope that had begun to spark within me. Katie, with her innocence and unconditional love, remained the delicate yet strong bridge between Edward and me. Each visit, she brought her scribbled drawings, proudly calling them gifts for Grandpa. Edward, despite his weakness, cherished each little drawing, carefully placing them in a small wooden box by his bedside, as if they were priceless treasures. I saw the change in him, slow but undeniable. One time, when Katie ran out to get water, Edward turned to me, his eyes glinting with an unfamiliar light. His voice trembled barely above a whisper. "Nolan, I was wrong." I stood frozen, staring into his reddened eyes, the first time I saw him reveal vulnerability and regret. I wanted to rush to him, to hug him, to say how long I'd waited for those words. But all I could do was stand there, nodding slightly, letting tears stream down my face. In that moment, between two men, between father and son, I felt a small crack in the wall that had separated us, opening just enough for forgiveness and regret to slip through. But time waits for no one. One morning, a nurse called me urgently to the hospital. Edward was weakening rapidly, his breathing labored, and the doctor said he had only a few days left. I brought Katie with me, though my heart was heavy. She sat by his side, singing her favorite song, but this time Edward didn't smile. He held Katie's hand, pulled her close, and whispered something to her. I couldn't hear it, only saw Katie nod solemnly, as if entrusted with an important task. When I asked, she simply said, "Grandpa told me to keep something, but it's a secret." Edward's final days passed quietly, like the cold autumn wind carrying away any hope of words left unspoken. After the urgent call from the nurse, I was practically at the hospital from morning to night. Every afternoon after school, I picked up Katie and brought her to the hospital. And from then on, the two of us practically lived in the hospital room where Edward lay. Edward lay there, his breathing faint, his once sharp eyes now dulled, as if gazing at a distant place I could never reach. Katie, ever innocent, sat by his side, singing children's songs, talking about our cat Muffin and the drawings she brought. But this time, Edward no longer smiled. He only gently squeezed Katie's small hand, his eyes occasionally drifting toward me. A look I couldn't fully decipher, perhaps regret, perhaps just the exhaustion of a man preparing to leave this world. On the final day, I stood in the corner of the room trying to suppress a sense of helplessness. Katie, still in her favorite green dress, sat beside Edward, whispering, "Grandpa, I'll be good, I promise." I didn't hear him respond, but I saw him hand Katie a small envelope, his trembling hands barely able to hold it. "Keep it safe," he whispered, his voice so faint I had to strain to hear. Katie nodded, serious as a soldier accepting a mission, and tucked the envelope into her pocket. I wanted to ask, but Katie's eyes, both resolute and mysterious, silenced me. I didn't know what was in the envelope, but I felt its weight. Not the weight of paper, but the significance it might carry. Edward passed away the next morning in the quiet of dawn. Katie and I were there, along with an elderly nurse, in the silence of machines that had stopped beeping. I held Katie tightly, letting her cry into my chest while I tried to hold back my own tears. Edward, the adoptive father who had once been the center of my world, was gone forever. I didn't know whether to feel grief or relief, only that a part of my past had closed, leaving an unfillable void. Edward's funeral was held at the Caldwell family's main mansion in Scottsdale, where I had grown up. It was an extravagant affair, true to Edward's style, a real estate tycoon who never did anything halfway. The main hall was adorned with white flowers, orchids, and marigolds stretching from the entrance to the altar, where a large portrait of Edward was prominently displayed. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, business partners in expensive suits, former colleagues offering hollow praise, Edward's old friends with regretful eyes, and distant relatives I rarely saw. My siblings, James, Clara, Victoria, and Henry, stood at the center, playing the role of dutiful children. Clara, in a designer black dress, kept adjusting her hair as if preparing for a photo shoot. James, holding a glass of whiskey, chatted with partners, his smile forced. Victoria and Henry were busy taking photos, posting on social media with captions dripping with fake emotion. I stood in the corner holding Katie's hand, trying to avoid everyone's gazes. Katie, in a small black dress, clutched her worn-out doll, her eyes red but resolute, refusing to cry in front of the crowd. "Daddy, is Grandpa happy now?" she whispered, looking at me with hopeful eyes. I squeezed her hand, unsure how to answer. I just wanted to leave, to escape the prying eyes and the whispers about the disowned adopted son lingering at the funeral. But I couldn't leave. After the ceremony, as the guests gradually left the mansion, Edward's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a tall, thin man with silver-rimmed glasses, requested that all of Edward's children stay behind. "Including you, Nolan," he said, his voice calm but firm. I felt Clara's icy stare when Mr. Thompson mentioned my name. James let out a mocking chuckle while Victoria whispered something to Henry, making them both giggle. I held Katie's hand tighter, trying to stay composed. I didn't know what was coming, but I sensed a storm approaching. We were led into the grand living room where the family portrait still hung on the wall, a painful reminder of the days I tried to belong. Mr. Thompson sat at the head of the table, a thick stack of documents in front of him. My siblings sat in a row, their eyes brimming with confidence, as if they already knew what they'd receive. Katie and I sat at the far end of the table like outsiders. Katie still held the envelope in her pocket, and I noticed her clutching it tightly as if afraid someone might take it. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and opened the documents. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. Edward Caldwell, drafted 3 years ago," he said, his voice steady. He began reading, listing Edward's vast estate, mansions in Scottsdale and Phoenix, dozens of acres of land in Arizona, shares in the Caldwell Corporation, a collection of vintage cars, and a yacht worth millions. Everything was divided equally among his 4 biological children, James, Clara, Victoria, and Henry. My name wasn't mentioned in the will. Not a single line, not a single reference. Clara let out a sharp laugh. "Well, Nolan, what are you doing here? Hoping for a slice of the pie?" Victoria chimed in, her tone mocking. "Maybe you thought you were still a Caldwell, but you're just a burden." James, with a contemptuous smile, added, "You're the reason Dad had a heart attack, Nolan. Don't pretend to grieve." Henry, usually quiet, spoke up. "Why don't you go back to your cheap repair shop?" Each of their words was like a knife, slicing into old wounds. I gripped Katie's hand, trying to stay calm, preparing to stand and leave. I was used to their humiliation, but I didn't want Katie to hear it. But then Katie, my little girl, stood up abruptly. "Stop it!" her voice rang out, small but firm, silencing the room. I was stunned as she pulled the envelope from her pocket, her hands trembling but her eyes blazing with determination. "Grandpa told me to give this to the lawyer," Katie said, stepping forward and placing the envelope in Mr. Thompson's hands. Clara frowned, James stopped laughing, and Victoria whispered something to Henry. My heart pounded as if the whole world was holding its breath. The light in the grand living room of the Caldwell mansion seemed to dim, as if the very air was holding its breath. Katie returned to her seat, squeezing my hand as if to encourage and comfort me. Across from me, my siblings, James, Clara, Victoria, and Henry, stared intently at Mr. Thompson, Edward's lawyer, as he slowly opened the handwritten letter from the envelope Katie had just handed him. Edward's trembling handwriting was clear on the page, but its power seemed to shake the entire room. I didn't know what was coming, but Clara's anxious glance and James's sharp exhale made my heart race. Katie, with her bright blue eyes, looked at me as if to say, "Daddy, everything will be okay." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses on his nose. "This is a handwritten will drafted by Mr. Edward Caldwell on March 15th, just days before his passing," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "This will is legally binding, bearing Mr. Edward's signature and fingerprint, along with the testimony of 2 nurses at the hospital. It supersedes the previous will, drafted 3 years ago." Clara let out a dry laugh, but her eyes were filled with tension. "A handwritten will? What is this, some kind of joke? James crossed his arms, glaring at me as if I were the culprit. Victoria whispered something to Henry and they exchanged bewildered looks. I sat still, trying to maintain a calm expression, but inside a storm was brewing. Katie squeezed my hand tighter as if sensing my unease. Mr. Thompson ignored the commotion. He continued reading, his voice steady but each word striking like a hammer. I, Edward Caldwell, in full mental clarity, declare the distribution of my estate as follows. 90% of my assets, including all real estate, shares in the Caldwell Corporation, bank accounts, cars, yacht, and other properties, shall be transferred to Nolan Caldwell and his daughter, Katie Caldwell. The remaining 10% shall be divided equally among my 4 biological children, James, Clara, Victoria, and Henry. The room fell into a stunned silence, as if the world had stopped turning. I felt the blood rush to my ears, my mind reeling. 90% of the estate? For me and Katie? I looked at Mr. Thompson, then at Katie, searching for a sign that this was just a dream. But Katie, with her resolute gaze, nodded slightly as if she had known this all along. My siblings, on the other hand, erupted. "What?" Clara screamed, standing so abruptly she knocked over her chair. "This is a forgery. It's impossible." James slammed his hand on the table, his face flushed with anger. "Nolan did something, I know it. He forced Dad to write this when he was dying." Victoria, usually composed, lost her cool, her voice trembling. "Dad couldn't do this to us. We're his real children." Henry, the youngest, sat silently, but his eyes were cold and calculating, as if plotting something. Mr. Thompson raised his hand, signaling for calm. "I'm not finished," he said, his voice still composed. He continued, and each word pierced my siblings' smugness like a dagger. "I leave 90% of my estate to Nolan and Katie because they have proven true loyalty and familial love. Nolan, despite my unfair treatment of him, quietly cared for me in my final days. Katie, my granddaughter, brought joy and hope that I found in no one else. I was wrong to disown Nolan, and I regret not supporting him in his times of hardship. He is the only son who truly understood the value of family." My throat tightened, tears welling up. Edward, the adoptive father who had once called me ungrateful and cast me out, had written these words. He had seen me not as an outsider, but as a true son. I looked at Katie, who smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Grandpa loved you, Daddy," she whispered, and I had to turn away to hide my tears. But my siblings didn't share my emotions. Clara lunged toward the table, snatching the will from Mr. Thompson's hands, her eyes wild. "This is fake. I don't believe it. Dad couldn't have done this." James stood, pointing at me. "You manipulated him, Nolan. You and that kid took advantage of him when he was weak." Victoria, her voice shrill, shouted, "You don't deserve a single cent. You're just an adopted nobody." Henry, though silent, glared at me with a hatred that felt like it could tear me apart. I wanted to respond, to shout that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I only visited Edward because of Katie, because I couldn't let her lose her grandfather without beautiful memories. But I stayed silent. I was used to their contempt, and I didn't want to argue on this day, the day Edward had left me his final apology. Katie, however, couldn't take it. "You're wrong," she shouted, her small voice brimming with strength. "Grandpa chose Daddy because Daddy's good. You didn't visit Grandpa, only Daddy and I did." The room fell silent again, and I saw Mr. Thompson smile faintly as if proud of Katie. Mr. Thompson stood, retrieving the will from Clara's hands. "This will is legally binding," he said firmly. "It was written in a state of mental clarity with a signature, fingerprint, and witnesses. If there are any disputes, the courts will review it, but I advise you to respect Mr. Edwards' wishes." He looked at me, nodding slightly as if to say he was on my side. Clara shot me a venomous glare before pulling James out of the room. "We'll sue!" she screamed. "I won't let Nolan take everything." James agreed, his voice full of rage. "You won't get away with this, Nolan. We'll overturn this will." Victoria and Henry followed, saying nothing, but their eyes told me they wouldn't give up easily. They stormed out of the mansion, leaving Katie and me in the silent room with Mr. Thompson packing up his documents. I pulled Katie into my arms, feeling her warmth. "Did I do something wrong, Katie?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She shook her head, hugging me tightly. "You didn't do anything wrong, Daddy. Grandpa knew you were good." Katie's simple, heartfelt words were like a balm to my heart. I looked at the will on the table, Edward's trembling handwriting, and felt a belated recognition I had never dared to dream of. But I knew the battle wasn't over. My siblings would sue, would do everything to overturn the will, and I had to be ready to face them, not just for the estate, but for the truth Edward had left behind. As Katie and I left the mansion, the Arizona sun shone brightly, but I felt a storm approaching. I held Katie's hand, stepping through the gate, knowing a long fight lay ahead. But this time, I wasn't alone. I had Katie and I had Edward's apology, a priceless gift I would protect at all costs. The weeks following Edward's funeral passed like a prolonged dream. Katie and I returned to our rented apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix, where the creaking ceiling fan and the smell of old wood still lingered. But now, that apartment was no longer just a temporary shelter. It was where I prepared for the biggest legal battle of my life. My siblings, James, Clara, Victoria, and Henry, had filed a lawsuit accusing me of manipulating Edward into writing the handwritten will, claiming it was a forgery and that I had taken advantage of his weakened state to steal the estate. Every day I received letters from their lawyers filled with threats and insults. But I wasn't afraid. Not because I was confident, but because I had Katie and Edward's apology, a belated recognition I would defend to the end. The trial was scheduled at the courthouse in downtown Phoenix, a cold granite building with long hallways and echoing footsteps. On the first day, I held Katie's hand as we walked into the courtroom, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes, lawyers, reporters, and old acquaintances of the Caldwell family. My siblings sat on the other side, dressed in expensive suits, their gazes venomous. Clara, with her perfectly styled hair, looked at me as if I were an insect. James crossed his arms, a contemptuous smirk never leaving his lips. Victoria whispered something to Henry, and they both chuckled as if certain of their victory. I squeezed Katie's hand, trying to stay calm. In her simple green dress, clutching her worn-out doll, she looked at me with resolute eyes. "Daddy, Grandpa believed in you," she whispered, and I felt a surge of strength rise within me. My lawyer, Ms. Elena Martinez, was a petite but sharp woman with unwavering eyes. She had spent weeks preparing, reviewing every detail of the handwritten will, gathering witness testimonies and building a strategy to defend Edward's wishes. Across from us was Mr. Richard Grayson, my sibling's lawyer, a tall man with a booming voice, renowned for overturning inheritance cases. "They'll do everything to paint you as an opportunist, Nolan," Elena warned me before the trial. "But we have the truth, and the truth will prevail." The trial began with Mr. Grayson's opening statement. He stood before the judge, his tone smooth but theatrical. "Your Honor, Nolan Caldwell, an adopted son, took advantage of Mr. Edward Caldwell's frail condition to coerce him into writing a fraudulent will, robbing the rightful inheritance of his biological children. Mr. Edward, in his final days, was not of sound mind to make such a decision. This was a calculated scheme, and we request that the court declare this handwritten will invalid." He turned to me, flashing a mocking smile, and I felt my blood boil. My siblings took the stand one by one. Clara, with her shrill voice, recounted how I was always the outsider, claiming I was jealous of them and schemed to seize the estate. James declared that I had brainwashed Edward in the hospital, using Katie to win his favor. Victoria, with crocodile tears, said she was heartbroken to see her father manipulated. Henry, as usual, said little, but his hateful glare spoke volumes. Each of their words was like a knife, but I sat still, holding Katie's hand, trying not to let anger overtake me. Katie, though only 8, seemed to understand everything. "They're lying, aren't they, Daddy?" she whispered, and I nodded, forcing a smile to reassure her. Elena stood, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, the handwritten will of Mr. Edward Caldwell is legally valid, written in a state of full mental clarity, with his signature, fingerprint, and the testimony of 2 credible witnesses. We will prove that Mr. Edward made this decision willingly, based on the love and care Nolan and his daughter Katie showed him in his final days. She called the first witness, Susan, the nurse who cared for Edward in the hospital. Susan, a middle-aged woman with a gentle voice, recounted the times Katie and I visited Edward. "Nolan never asked for anything from Mr. Edward," she said, looking directly at the judge. "He just stood in the corner of the room letting Katie talk to her grandfather. Katie brought drawings, sang to him, and I saw Mr. Edward smile, something he rarely did with anyone else." She paused, glancing at my siblings. "I didn't see Mr. Edward's biological children there often. They'd stop by, ask a few questions, then leave." The second witness was Edward's doctor, Dr. David Patel. He confirmed that Edward was fully lucid when he wrote the will. "He was physically weak but mentally sound," Dr. Patel said. "He told me he wanted to amend his will to do the right thing for Nolan and Katie. I was present when he signed the document, along with Susan and another nurse." Elena presented further evidence, security camera footage from the hospital showing Katie and me visiting regularly, while my siblings rarely appeared. She also submitted Katie's drawings, carefully kept by Edward in a box by his bedside, as proof of his affection for us. With each piece of evidence, I saw my siblings' faces pale. Clara bit her lip, James clenched his fists, and Victoria whispered frantically to Henry, her eyes filled with panic. But Mr. Grayson didn't give up. He called a psychologist who claimed Edward might have been psychologically influenced by Katie's presence. "An 8-year-old child can easily evoke sympathy, especially in a frail elderly person," he argued. I felt my blood boil. Katie, my little girl, described as a tool of manipulation? I wanted to stand and shout at him, but Elena placed a hand on my shoulder, whispering, "Stay calm, Nolan. We're winning." The turning point came when Elena called Katie to testify. I was worried, not wanting her to face the pressure of the courtroom, but Katie was resolute. "I want to tell the truth for Grandpa," she said, her voice small but firm. Standing before the judge in her green dress and clutching her doll, Katie recounted our visits to Edward. "I sang for Grandpa and he smiled. He said he loved Daddy and wanted Daddy to be happy. He gave me the envelope and told me to keep it safe." Her voice was clear and sincere, silencing the courtroom. The judge, an older man with a stern gaze, looked at Katie with respect, and I saw his eyes glisten. After 3 tense days, the judge delivered his ruling. "The handwritten will of Mr. Edward Caldwell is legally valid," he declared, his voice resounding. "The court finds no evidence of manipulation or lack of mental clarity. Mr. Edward's wishes will be honored." Katie and I officially inherited 90% of Edward's estate, the mansions, land, shares, and everything else. My siblings, with the remaining 10%, left the courtroom in silence, their faces crestfallen. Clara shot me one last hateful glance but said nothing. James, Victoria, and Henry followed quietly, their taunts and threats gone. I hugged Katie, tears streaming down my cheeks. "We did it, Daddy," she whispered, and I nodded, unable to speak. This victory wasn't just about the estate. It was about Edward's belated recognition that I, the disowned adopted son, was his true son. As we left the courtroom, the Arizona sun shone brightly as if welcoming a new beginning. I held Katie's hand, feeling the new chapters of our lives approaching. 3 months after the trial, Katie and I stood in a quiet cemetery nestled among the low hills on the outskirts of Scottsdale. I held Katie's hand, walking slowly along the stone-paved path leading to the Caldwell family plot. Today, we were here to visit Edward's grave, my adoptive father, who had left us not only his estate but also a belated recognition, a gift more precious than any mansion or share. Katie, now 8 years old, wore her favorite green dress and held a small bouquet of white daisies, her blue eyes bright but tinged with sadness. I looked at her, my heart filled with gratitude for the little girl who had become the bridge connecting me to Edward and now to my past. Edward's grave lay under the shade of an old oak tree next to the grave of my adoptive mother, Margaret, who had passed away over a decade ago. The 2 granite headstones were simple yet dignified, their names gleaming in the sunlight. I stood before Edward's grave reading the inscription, Edward Caldwell, 1949 to 2025, devoted father, steadfast leader. My heart tightened, recalling the days he called me ungrateful. But then I remembered the final words in his will. I was wrong to disown Nolan. He is the only son who truly understood the value of family. Those words, though late, had healed a deep wound within me. Katie knelt down, placing the bouquet of white daisies on Edward's grave. "Grandpa, thank you," she whispered, her voice small but sincere. "Daddy and I promised to live well, like you wanted." I knelt beside her, resting my hand on her shoulder, feeling her warmth, the only light that had guided me through the darkest days. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice hoarse, unsure if I was speaking to Edward or to myself. "Thank you for seeing me, for giving me a chance to prove myself." Tears rolled down my cheeks, but this time they carried no pain, only release. I glanced at Margaret's grave, the adoptive mother who was always gentle but distant. I didn't blame her, just as I no longer blamed Edward. They had given me a home, imperfect as it was, and now I had Katie, my true family. I stood taking Katie's hand, and we lingered there for a while, letting the breeze carry away the painful memories, leaving only love and healing. "Daddy, is Grandpa happy?" Katie asked, looking up at me. I smiled, brushing her hair. "He's happy, Katie. He knows you and I made him proud." We left the cemetery as the sun set, casting a radiant orange glow over the Arizona desert. Katie and I now lived in the Scottsdale mansion with an estate worth hundreds of millions. But those numbers meant nothing compared to the moment I held Katie's hand, knowing we had overcome every challenge. My siblings, James, Clara, Victoria, and Henry, no longer contacted me. They left Phoenix after the trial, taking their 10% of the estate and their bitterness with them. I didn't hate them. I only hoped that one day they too would find the peace I had. My and Katie's story is a testament to the power of truth and family love. Katie, the 8-year-old with a heart larger than life, became the catalyst for healing the deep wounds between Edward and me. His belated recognition not only restored my place in the family, but also gave me faith that, even when cast aside, one's value and voice will be acknowledged if they persevere and live true to themselves. As Katie and I walked out of the cemetery hand in hand, I felt whole, not just because of the wealth or the legal victory, but because Katie's love and Edward's apology had given me a true family.